All right. In the introduction, I'm here at Stanford now, and I have been here for 2 years, and I work on cyber policy and I work on cyber policy and security issues here at Stanford, and do a lot of work with policymakers and so on cybersecurity. I spent 25 years in Washington before that. 29 years in Washington before that, working IT policy issues, and before that I was a congressional staff member, a staff scientist for a congressional committee. So I have some familiarity with the way in which the system works. The story that was just told about technology and so on, and putting criminality in your pockets. Some years ago, I came across a wonderful saying to the effect that there are three roads to ruin. Sex is the most fun, alcohol is the fastest, and technology is the most certain. And I have come to believe that, and over the years I have become a late adopter of technology for exactly that reason. Let somebody else be on the bleeding edge. So I'm here to talk because a last-minute speaker canceled, and that's fine. I was going, so you're the first audience that I've given this talk to. The Presidential Commission released a report. That report last Friday. In fact, publicly. It was given to the president on Thursday, the day before, and this is the result of 7 months of deliberation on what you will see is a very broad charge. Okay. The Commission will make detailed recommendations to strengthen cybersecurity in both the public and private sectors while protecting privacy, ensuring safety, public safety, national economic security, fostering discovery and development of new technical solutions, and bolstering partnerships between federal, state, and local governments and the private sector in the development, promotion, and use of cybersecurity technologies, best practices, and policies. Okay, that's a mouthful. It's a very broad charge, right? And we had 7 months to produce a report on this. We had the report is available online at that website. If you just type in into a Google search "Cybersecurity Commission Report," the URL pops up. Of most pride of us on the committee, on the commission, is that it's posted on the White House site. Not just in this site, which was the group that organized it. This is the site that was established to manage it, manage the whole process. We had a variety of public meetings and so on, and it was charged by executive order to be created. The broad context for the commission here is that in February of 2013, so about 3.5 years ago, the Obama administration issued an executive order, a presidential order, on improving critical infrastructure of cybersecurity. That is, critical infrastructure is supposed to be that infrastructure largely in the private sector that is critical for national operations, for national activity. So it's things like the banking system, the electric grid, and so on.
Does it include the election?
Well, that's an interesting question. The answer is no, except insofar as state and local governments were in fact included in that. And as you may know, elections are the electoral machinery is a part of state and local governments. I will talk about that later, and if you want to talk about that more during the discussion, I'm happy to do that. This led to something called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Now, NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, had had responsibility for creating this framework. It's a voluntary framework for critical infrastructure organizations to manage their cybersecurity. It was intended to give people give agencies and entities within the private sector that think about cybersecurity, that provide critical infrastructure services to think about cybersecurity, a language to talk about their cybersecurity efforts and how they've made progress and so on. And it was meant to be entirely voluntary. 3 years later, the administration announced its National Cybersecurity Action Plan and created the commission. This is the commission that I sat on, and it was drawn from business and former government and academia. And we were tasked to create the recommendations as I described earlier. And the idea was to concrete recommendations to improve cybersecurity over the next decade. That was the intent. Okay, what can the U.S. government do? It's meant to provide a roadmap for the next president. Throughout most of the process, we didn't know who the next president was going to be, and we were really quite scrupulous in not identifying Republicans or Democrats. The chair of the commission is known to be a Democrat. The vice chair of the commission is known to be a Republican. But beyond that, you could not tell by listening to the people around the table who was R and who was D. Okay, this was a list of the commissioners. Donnellan was a former National Security Advisor to the President, Democrat, obviously, and Sam Palmisano, former CEO of IBM, Vice Chair, known to be Republican. But as I say, everyone else there, the political affiliation is unknown, and that was not a consideration in either their selection or, in fact, in any of the discussions. I'll tell you quite candidly that there were really no ideological discussions among the commissioners. It was all very pragmatic. We all had ideologies, but it was all very pragmatic. Ranging from Keith Alexander to who was a former NSA director, president of MasterCard. President of the Chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh System, former NIST director. Okay, a wide variety of players. Yeah.
Looks very rich in policy expertise. Was there much technical expertise?
I would say yes. There was significant technical expertise on the committee, on the commission, but an interesting. You should bring that. You should tee that up in the discussion in the discussion question. So the question there is, how much technical expertise do you actually need to know in order to make good policy?
A lot.
Well, that I recognize that view. Okay, and we let's have that discussion. Okay, I have a view that says that it's not as much as you think, okay? And we can talk about that. All right. So that's us, okay? I'm not in there, but that's us. Here's something that we did not. Here's what we didn't do, okay? And this is important, okay? We focused on the digital economy, and if you look at the text of the executive order, it really emphasizes things that are related to the economy, not encryption, not active defense and hackback, not the role of offensive cyber operations in national policy, not cyber operations as part of defense strategy, not internet governance, a variety of things we didn't do. Okay? All of those are important. All of those are adjacent to the space of internet. Of the digital economy, but they're not centrally the focus. And believe me, the internet economy, the digital economy is big enough by itself. Okay, so we circumscribed what we did. We tried to identify foundational principles. Now these are principles. They're not principles in the sense that a physicist or an engineer would would characterize them, right? These are sort of premises that we go into it with, in a sense. I mean, these are principles that shaped our thinking. So let me say some things. Okay, so the first. And I'll spend a fair amount of time on this slide here. The first, on timing, this goes for what, an hour? An hour and 15 minutes. Okay, fine, including Q&A.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it can last till late in the morning.
Once the camera is off,
Fine.
everything.
Okay.
Insurance can come out.
Fine. There's a convergence between cyber and physical systems, as we see with IoT. We had on October 21st, we had a massive DDoS attack that brought down many important commercial websites, and was unable to, brought it down, and it was traced back to a botnet, living in IoT devices. Okay. So that was an interesting. That was interesting. It was an object lesson that the IoT and what we normally regard as plain old information technology are coming together. Okay. We think we had the premise. I mean, it was a national commission established by the President of the United States, okay? So not surprisingly, we had a very U.S.-centric view of what we should be doing. We think that the U.S. has an important role as a standard bearer for cybersecurity because we have this role in global innovation. The feds has ultimate responsibility for the nation's defense and security. We don't privatize the ICBM force, nuclear submarines, okay? And there are some threats against which the United States really needs a government to respond to, okay? And you can argue about where that line is in cyberspace, and we did a lot of that argument, and we recognize that that's an argument, but in the end, the ultimate responsibility does lie with the federal government for certain levels of threats that are very, very large. We can argue about where that line is. Okay? At the same time, private sector is really important, right? Because the private sector has a lot of expertise and a lot of infrastructure and a lot of incentive to protect, okay, to defend. And they own and operate a lot of stuff. And you can't just pass a law telling them what to do. Okay? That's a very difficult thing if you don't live in a command and control economy. And so you have to, you have to find ways of persuading people to cooperate with you, structuring incentives. I mean, so the language there is incentives, it's persuasion, it's appealing to self-interest, those kinds of phrases, not, you must do X. Now, that's the regulation side of the house, and in fact, we did not completely avoid the issue of regulation. We did not say never regulation. Question is when and where, and I'll talk about that later too. Responsibility, authority, capability, and accountability within every enterprise's risk management strategies, they have to be aligned with each other. And this is true in the government as well. So just as one example of how you don't get alignment, okay, you may wonder, and we spent a fair amount of time in working on this, you may wonder why the federal government is so screwed up when it comes to information technology. That's not a bad question to ask. Okay? As taxpayers, some of you are taxpayers, most of you are probably taxpayers in here, US citizens and so on. Why is your government unable to deal with information technologies successfully? Well, one reason is that it doesn't, a government department that buys information technology doesn't get to set its own budget, right? It gets set by the Congress every year. And there are whims that the Congress implements or doesn't implement and so on. And the idea of a stable budget is completely foreign to the way in which government agencies operate, okay? So if any of you who have ever worked in private industry, you know the idea of investing now to save money in the future. You understand that idea. Well, it doesn't happen in government, right? There's no idea that we'll save money in the future. Okay, it'll help our, but no, Congress will take it away and give it to somebody else. Okay? So that's an example of how incentives are misaligned. Okay? In the private sector, another example of how incentives are misaligned. Okay? We always hear about how it's so important to put cybersecurity, build cybersecurity into the design of a product from the beginning. Right? We always hear that. Again and again. It can't just be an afterthought in the end. Why is it always an afterthought? It's an interesting question. You think about the economics of it all. If you're trying to get a product out to service, which is going to be faster? Getting a product that's out where you just pay attention on the functionality of the product, or you pay attention to the functionality of the product and security? It's going to be harder to do 2 tasks rather than 1. Okay? The answer is it's going to be harder to do 2 tasks. And so the guy who gets it out without security has a market advantage, right? He gets to...
Not so. But go ahead.
Well, we can argue. Well, if you don't believe that, we can argue about that, okay? You may say that that shouldn't be the case, but
It's easier to do it securely if you start right.
I don't believe that for a minute, and we can talk about that. But okay, so we will talk about that. All right. We believe that the cybersecurity problem had to be pushed away from the end users. Right? How many times have you found that you had to make a personal security decision? Right? Do you accept the fact that this website has, the certificate isn't quite valid? Right? And do you click through? And sort of the default behavior is yes. Okay, right? Do you check do you really check the certificate? Do you really want to view the certificate? All those sorts of questions. Okay, no. Okay, so we want to push the security away from the end user. Okay. How far? That's another question, but that's the philosophy of it. You should configure technologies and products in such a way that it's easy to do the right thing and hard to do dangerous things. That seems like an obvious thing, but it's honored more in the breach than anywhere else. I already addressed the question about private security and trust be primary considerations rather than doing it at the end. We'll have the argument later. Small and medium-sized enterprises, the SME, are essential stakeholders. One of the things that the government has done is to focus a lot of attention, I think until now, on the big guys, on really big entities. Not a bad place to start, but our conclusion here is that the small and medium enterprises need a lot of help. The big firms, they already have the help. They're swimming in cybersecurity expertise. Yeah.
There's another meaning of SME, which is subject
matter expertise. That's right.
And that would also apply.
Right, and we can talk about that, about the level of technical expertise that we want.
Or just that they're essential stakeholders.
Yes, okay, that's right. And we talk about incentives a lot in the report. Did you have?
How about safety? Are you including safety to this?
Sure. I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, safety and reliability and so on, yes. The incentives part was an essential focus of our work, which was that we want to emphasize incentives and reliance on market forces whenever possible to enhance cybersecurity. We don't like regulation. Okay, we really don't like it. Doesn't mean we'll never do it, but we don't like it.
Haven't we been trying to do that for like 20 years?
Yes, and we can, and yes, how can you, so the question that comes from the back of the room is, haven't we been doing trying to avoid regulation for a very long time, and this is where where we wound up, okay? And that is a not very satisfactory situation, and so on. I think our answer to that has been that nobody has created the right incentives for that. And so the incentives has not been a successful approach. The fact that some set of incentives hasn't worked isn't a damning call to say that all of them will be ineffective. That's the argument.
I would also say, point out that the political sphere expects a direct solution, whereas in our field, we solve problems iteratively, and it is rare that a solution works the first time. Had we put security in the original network control program for the ARPANET, that ARPANET probably would not have succeeded, just because we would have been bogged down in the early security aspects.
So so when at the end of this conversation, the question is, that's right. And so in that conversation, I'm going to put the two of you guys to argue with each other, and I'll just sit back. Okay, so that's so there you go. That's correct. Okay, I come down on that side, but yeah.
In terms of incentives, Silicon Valley is becoming deathly afraid that they won't have a market for their products, either domestically or especially foreign, because there's no way to verify that security services don't have massive access to their data centers.
Yes, yes, I agree that is definitely a concern.
And that's on the table starting in January.
Yes, I understand, and you'll note that that's one of the issues. That is a different issue of a different version of the encryption issue, and we didn't talk about that. So, for reasons that you can imagine. So you're right. It is definitely a concern, and we can have a discussion afterwards on that, where I could tell you my own personal views about it, but not represent the views of the commission. We organized a report around what we called 6 imperatives, okay, under which were grouped multiple recommendations and multiple action items. Okay, so the first imperative was to say, secure today's internet and information technology infrastructure. Right? So do a better job of securing what you have. Okay, and this is what do you have now? How can you make it better? Okay, rather than inventing something that's still better than that. Okay, so among the things that we talked about in there were the idea that we have to, the first thing listed here is that we have to increase the robustness of the net against denial of service, spoofing and the like, and other attacks on users that sort of use the basic structure and connectivity of the net to complicate your life. The second was an effort to defend and secure what we called the converged IT infrastructure. This is both the cyber-physical devices and the plain old cyber devices. That, I mean, there was even discussion of the question: does the meaning of critical? Is there no longer such a thing as critical infrastructure? Is everything critical now? And you know, so that's an interesting question. One of the observations that was made during the course of this our deliberations was that if you look at the DHS definition of critical infrastructure, it actually encompasses a very large fraction of the U.S. economy. So you remember the attack on Sony a couple of years ago? It turns out that Sony Pictures Entertainment counts as critical infrastructure. Okay? Yes, it really does. It is in the official definition because it's part of the entertainment sector. Would anybody disagree with that? No, it's clearly part of the entertainment sector. The entertainment sector, or the entertainment companies, are part of the commercial sector. And you will find commercial sector listed under one of 16 sectors of critical infrastructure. Now, does this make any sense? That's an interesting question. Okay. In the old construct, it didn't. Maybe in the new world it does, because maybe Sony Pictures Entertainment computers are going to be the source of interesting malware that that goes out and gives the rest of the world problems. Okay, so we don't know. The point is that there is this convergence. Some aspects of that, this is something that a lot of people care a lot about. Many attempts to deal with this, and we'll continue along those lines, about improving information exchange. One of the issues with information exchange is that you've got to get, I mean, today information exchange is often by fax, okay, and there's no good, you can't really exchange information in a machine readable, actionable way. Then the other aspect of it is taking action based on information that you get. That's hard too. So that the entire information exchange infrastructure needs to be enhanced. We also worried a lot about things like security of GPS and various wireless networks and so on. That you know how critical GPS is. Just as one example, GPS matters even if you're not moving, right? Because because timing issues. It's the source of a common reference clock. That's right. The fact that there's a global clock that people use is a big deal. Okay. We thought a lot about the question of strong authentication. Our goal, we have an aspirational goal that will be able to eliminate passwords by 2020. No, that's not really. If you would ask me, am I going to bet on that? The answer is no. But that's not a bad aspirational goal. That you want to have really strong authentication be the basis of access to parts of the net and online services and so on that you need it for. Yeah.
I would contend that we should reduce our emphasis on authentication and focus more on authorization. And that is the main objection I have to the best practices that NIST is putting out.
Say more.
So one of the things about authentication is if I need him to do the task for me, he doesn't have permission if you're relying on authentication. If you're relying on authorization, you authorize me, I can authorize him, he can act on my behalf. That is a fundamental failure and the root cause of many of our problems.
Okay, fair enough. We can have more discussion about that later too. No in principle disagreement from me here, except to say that we make the observation that lots of problems come about because of compromised user credentials today.
And that is because of the fundamental model that's being used. You can reduce that by reducing the emphasis on authentication.
Okay. The other aspect of it was that we wanted to have the U.S. government be just one source of authoritative credentials for validating digital identities. Okay, not the only one. The idea that the government would be your gatekeeper to online services was not a popular one among us. But so
Maybe need to have that.
I'm sorry?
The person may need to have multiple authentications.
That's right. For different purposes. That's right.
Absolutely.
And so so it's not one identity. I mean, we were very conscious here of the need to avoid the national ID card phenomena, right? You don't want your authentication credential to be the equivalent of a national ID card. Okay, and that has all kinds of privacy implications. We didn't want to go down that path. So I'm sympathetic to what you're saying.
But there's a related problem. If Google takes away my Gmail, I'm lost. They take away my Google account, I am lost. So there is an issue here of the sources of the credentials have enormous power over us, and that seems to be a flaw in the thinking of what's going on, and I don't see that was addressed here.
It was addressed to the extent that we said that there should be multiple sources. Okay,
Is this in relation to like certificate authorities? So then the U.S. government, as a certificate authority, would need to work with the Chrome browser to get it hard baked as a certificate authority. So it has to work with industry to actually get it into each operating system.
That would, implementing this would in fact call for something like that if you wanted to be able to, yes, if you wanted to enable an individual to use these, a U.S. government authorized credential to file an income tax return, for example, which would not be a bad idea. You wouldn't want it to have to do with everything, but for filing income tax returns, not a bad thing. Yeah, there would have to be something like that. Yeah.
I propose we let you continue with the presentation you prepared. I get frustrated when we hijack
Fine.
the presenter talks.
Okay.
We can get back to this during the
Fair
Q&A.
enough. We thought that the NIST cybersecurity framework was a good thing that helped a lot of players get involved in a way with cybersecurity that they weren't able to before. That it gives them a language, a way of planning, a process, processes and ways of understanding the extent and nature of the risk that they face in the cyberspace. We said that U.S. government agencies should be using the framework. Notice that the framework was originally created to deal with critical infrastructure. We thought it had broader applicability than that. We thought that existing regulations on cybersecurity, of which there are many, should be aligned with the framework. We want the framework to be a common language, sort of the lingua franca of cybersecurity. And we wanted to have liability protection of some sort, liability, limits on liability and so on for parties that adopt the framework. Now, in saying that, there's actually some code in that statement, okay, which is that it's a statement that there will be liability for cybersecurity breaches. Okay, we actually think that that's coming. That's inevitable. And you may know that the IT industry has successfully avoided liability for cybersecurity problems for a very long time. We don't think that's sustainable. That's just a prediction. That's not that's not a recommendation and so on. That's just a prediction. And so we're saying that to the extent that you have liability, the defenses against liability involve things like best practices and so on. One of the best practices would be to use the framework. Support. We talked about supporting small and medium-sized enterprises and business in the use of the framework as well. The second imperative had to do with securing tomorrow's digital economy, and here the IoT comes in with full force. We talked about finding ways to improve IoT security, and this is one of the things where I would argue, I would take very strong issue with the claim made that if you do cybersecurity right, you're advantaged rather than disadvantaged. IoT devices right now have really crappy security built into them. Common default passwords, common and so on, and how you get to secure them, how you have to secure them is a problem, and there are all kinds of reasons why you don't put them in from the beginning when you're trying to grab market share. There are existing regulatory agencies that do regulate cybersecurity, that do regulate industries, and cybersecurity should be a part of that assessment process. So, for example, if you're a regulatory authority that cares about the reliability of the electric grid, which there are some of, you should also be looking at cybersecurity for the electric grid. And there is existing regulatory authority where they can do those things. And we thought that we should look and see what the law would allow for security liability for IoT devices. We thought that there should be R&D, a focus of R&D on the development of usable and affordable, inherently secure systems. Okay, so every word in there was actually negotiated. Okay, that usable security, right? The idea that security functionality should be useful is a really big deal, right? that you don't want people to bypass the security because it's too inconvenient to use. Affordable. Okay. The cost of developing really secure software, really reliable software, really in the language that I know of, for avionics, the cost of avionics software is something like 10 to 100 times the cost of ordinary software. Okay. It's a lot more secure, it's a lot more reliable, maybe fewer bugs in it, but it's not really affordable for general purpose use. The inherently secure part, this is it's designed from the ground up. Resilient and recoverable. Okay, the bad guy will get in, and so how do you configure your system in a way that enables you to recover from a penetration quickly and with minimal damage? Lots of human factors in this. Lots of non-technical factors in it. So that's a big deal in this too. We thought that there was a role for preparing consumers to live in this age. Right? Consumers do not know how to manage cybersecurity. We heard the story earlier about individuals not being able to manage cybersecurity properly. And that's very true. I mean, I confess in many cases I'm unable to manage cybersecurity very well either. I'm one of the people who also clicks through on the personal security decisions about a certificate. Let's see. So we want them to be more informed. So one idea that we heard about that we really liked was the idea of a, quote, nutrition label on a product, which would tell you what goes into it. Okay, so this was an idea that was brought to us by Mudge Zako, who used to work at DARPA. He's been asked by the US government to set up a firm to do this kind of, not rating of security, but to say this is what goes into it. And there'll be some listing of components in it, and you can make your assessment as to whether or not those components are secure. It would provide you at least with more information than you have now. How you translate that into something usable by the consumer, that's an exercise for the reader. Right, that's something for the future. We want a consumer awareness campaign. We want a consumer bill of rights to say what should consumers be expected, be a reasonable expectation for them to have. What should they be able to expect in the way of cybersecurity? And what are their responsibilities? What do they have to do in order to be secure? And there's a support for a usable R&D, that is a user orientation. We talked about cybersecurity workforce capabilities, that there's certainly a role for educating specialists, people who do cybersecurity full-time, no question about that. But we don't think that everybody who touches cybersecurity has to be an expert. Everybody has to know something about cybersecurity. In particular, we're thinking here that middle managers and so on, that lots of non-practitioners also ought to know something about cybersecurity. That's hard. I'm actually right now working on a project to look at what cybersecurity knowledge I can give in a useful way to senior policymakers, like congressmen and their staffs, congresspeople and their staffs. I certainly am not going to be able to get them to the a lot level, and they're not going to do it. How can I? What's the minimum that I can give them that'll help them make at least marginally more sensible decisions? It's an interesting question.
Is knowledge about cybersecurity not something which should be constantly changing in this time?
There are things that change constantly, and there are things that are fundamental principles that remain the same. So, figuring out the right mix of that is admittedly difficult. Okay, so we also said that you have to pay attention to cybersecurity in K-12. That's an interesting argument and point of view, and I think that's right. How we get it into an already crowded curriculum, that's going to be an interesting question, but we put down our marker. And we also thought about the idea of technological innovation that can reduce the need for full-time specialists. Okay, so these are the guys who, for example, want to write programs that will do automatic patch generation. It could be an interesting thing to do that could help. There was once upon a time when you thought that if the volume of long-distance phone calls was going to go up, every person in the country would have to be a telephone system operator. Okay? Well, guess what? We are, right? But the reason we can do it now is because technology has moved along. Okay? And the question is there an analogous situation here with cybersecurity? Improving the cybersecurity of the U.S. government. This is a big deal. One idea here was to point out that the U.S. government is really like a bunch of small and medium businesses put together under one roof. It's not this monolithic entity. Agency A and Agency B have completely different IT needs. Okay? So we thought that rather than having each of them, every agency just struggle with basic issues about connectivity to the internet and so on, we should all consolidate it in one place. And the government should buy it all from one agency within the U.S. government. You may think that's a minor thing. That's a big deal in the U.S. government. We thought about, I mentioned multi-year budgeting. We really thought that multi-year budgeting would really help, okay, for reasons that should be obvious. We thought that they should move to a risk management approach rather than just a bunch of checklists of requirements. The difference is that if it's just a checklist of requirements, cybersecurity becomes completely divorced from the actual mission of the agency. Whereas if you focus on risk management, you can see how your cybersecurity posture affects how you can execute your mission. Let's see. And we thought that the way in which the U.S. government itself is organized at the top mattered. We thought that there should be an assistant to the president for cybersecurity, just comparable to the assistant to the president for counterterrorism. That is very senior in the White House. Cybersecurity, we thought that there should be a new cybersecurity strategy in the first 6 months. Should be a new agency or a repurposed old agency perhaps within DHS, perhaps somewhere else. We were silent on that part to handle operational cybersecurity within the U.S. government exclusively. States to leverage the National Guard. This was a big deal too, because the National Guard has a lot of civilians in it who stay current with technology in their day jobs. Right? How can we bring them in? How can we use them effectively? And states can use them in particular in ways that the federal government can't. The last one was focusing on international issues in the economy. We thought that there should be an emphasis on developing common standards and assessment activities. There's a bunch of harmonization that needs to be done. This is the term of art that says that our laws ought to be consistent with the laws in another country. If, for example, if you want to do extradition for certain computer crimes and so on, you want there to be similar laws there as here. And we wanted to promote peacetime norms of responsible behavior on cybersecurity through a variety of ways. The MLAT process there has to do with it's the mutual legal assistance treaties. This is how Nation A communicates with Nation B in an extradition request, for example, and how there are policy dimensions to that and technical information exchange dimensions to that. And we thought that those should be improved. Yeah.
So if there's going to be harmonizing, how are we going to harmonize with the new UK Investigatory Powers Act?
That's a very good question, and nobody knows the answer to that. Nonetheless, the question of harmonization is an important question. Okay, if you're going to maintain relations outside, and there are many people who have different views of what the most likely path for this is. Okay, are we looking at a more unified world or a more balkanized world? And that's a very interesting question. The commission did not address that point. I have my own views on it, which I can talk about later. But I'm getting to near the end, I promise. So these are some salient points that I think that are personal observations that are implied but not explicitly stated in the report. I think that the report really says that the market has failed to produce the cybersecurity that we need. Okay, and you can decide how you want to respond to that market failure, but really the market has failed to give us what we want. We say that non-technical issues are as important as technology. That's really an important statement, I think. That as soon as you start talking incentives, you're talking about economics, psychology, organization, policy, law, and those are things that are very important. We don't rule out regulation. It's the last resort. Incentives are the thing that we want to go right now, but in the background there is a potential for regulation, a possibility for regulation. I mentioned this earlier. Liability for security breaches is going to come. Don't know where, don't know how, don't know when, but it's going to come. And maybe policymakers ought to step out in front of that. There's no silver bullet. You recognize that phrase from a variety of other works. No silver bullet here. Okay, that's why our recommendations cover such a broad waterfront. I've seen many press articles about this. It emphasizes, some reports emphasizes A, some reports emphasize B, and so on and so forth. The reason is there's not one single individual recommendation that stands out. The problem is we think that all of them are necessary, and there are no silver bullets here.
Clinton famously said that she was going to have a Manhattan Project for cybersecurity. Did you consider that possibility?
Nobody understood. There was some discussion of that, and we concluded that nobody understood what it meant. So there you go.
Yes.
We have a quota of 2 questions per person.
Sure.
Okay.
You're done.
And the last thing about this is, of course, this obviously wasn't part of a report. What is the Trump administration going to do? Damned if I know. Okay. I do know that during the campaign, both Clinton and Trump agreed that cybersecurity was really an important issue. Okay? That was clear. Trump has said, I want to do more offensive actions in cyberspace. Okay? You got to punch as well as block in cyberspace. And we may see that. Who knows? Okay? My personal research specialization here at Stanford, when I write and so on, it often deals with the use of offensive operations in cyberspace as instruments of national policy. That doesn't mean I think they're always a good idea, but what I do is I examine the implications of using them in that way. If you want more information about any of this stuff, you can contact me here. And I am particularly interested in engaging with tech-savvy people who have any policy interests here. So with that, let's open it up for discussion and argument. And these questions that you disagreed with me on, let's start back there.
So, winnowed down to my quota of 2 questions. So, first question is, especially as we saw with the amount of time that it took for the Trans-Pacific Partnership to get up and running, to negotiate, to wind down, and then eventually probably to die, how does geographic scope and the speed at which treaty negotiations take place deal with the speed of technical development? I mean, BGP as a protocol doesn't have any concept of national borders, even though the agreements between ISPs might.
So you're saying is the traditional model of international treaties the way to go to get a handle on security in cybersecurity in a borderless environment, in a borderless cyberspace?
Harmonization.
Right. So the answer to that, I think, is no, they're not compatible. That's why we emphasized, and that's why the State Department and so on have emphasized the value of norms of behavior. That is, treaties are very complicated instruments. They take a very long time to negotiate. They're very hard to get approval for. And I gotta say that from personal view, from what I see, there's kind of an allergy to treaties. There's actually historically always been analogy to treaties. That's why it takes a 2/3 majority of the Senate to approve a treaty, rather than just a simple majority. And so I think that that's a problem. I actually have a postdoc here right now working on the question of the non-national organizations that are not governments that that work to promote cybersecurity and stability of the internet, such as the ISPs. So the role that the various organizations within the Internet Society play, and so on. There's a very robust but fragile infrastructure underlying the stability of the net that we know. All of them are in some sense intellectual descendants of John Postel, right? And what he did at one point was, had to be scaled up, and of course he's no longer with us, but what he did was to sort of run the internet. He used the closest thing to an internet master that anybody ever saw. And now all of these organizations have sprung up behind. Nations don't understand that part. And it's, so as I say, I have the postdoc working on how to promote an understanding of that and getting rid of getting rid of this notion. I mean, my aspiration goes to get rid of the notion that governments are going to take over that kind of function because they can't do it, in my view.
Did you have chance to look into problem of aging devices? IoT
I'm
devices?
sorry, of what?
Problem of aging IoT devices which came old. It expected that IoT devices sometime last years, decades. And
IoT
you
devices
will
that
review, you recommend review policy each half year. So it would be impractical to replace devices embedded in some house and inside of wall.
Refrigerator is used for 20 years.
Yes, and the question of how you update and refresh and so on is a big deal. Nobody knows how to do stuff that's bug-free, and nobody can anticipate the features that people are going to want in the future, and they don't want to replace their whole refrigerator in order to do it. Okay, so if you put a path into it, then because you don't want to be stuck with what's old, then what's new could be bad. As well as good, and so I agree that's a constant tension, and that's one of the issues that you have to deal with.
It needs to be solved on architectural level, actually.
No disagreement with me on that. But no, we didn't get into that level of detail. We said this is an issue that has to be addressed.
On your market failed, is the GSA big enough player to significantly influence the market? And if the GSA said, I don't know.
Right, the GSA is the General Services Administration, and they buy stuff for the U.S. government. And the question is, are they big enough to say, I want something that's really secure, and to influence the companies to develop a really secure version and then give it to the government, and then they can sell it to the commercial world. Turns out that the idea of using government procurement authority does come up. That is a recommendation in the report, that we want to use government procurement authority to increase security and so on. There are those of us who look at the checkered past of such attempts and sort of wonder whether or not that's really a viable model. So, yeah, it's certainly worth trying. Whether or not it'll actually succeed, given that all the other attempts that have not succeeded, that were based on the same model, not clear yet. Other argument? Over here.
Can you speak a bit more to what, if anything, the report says as to attribution, both in terms of the thorny issue of how to do it correctly and the political and diplomatic issues that arise potentially from nation state?
No, the report does not address attribution per se in that regard. I agree that if you do a search on the word attribution in the report, I don't remember it coming up. So I think that we did not. I actually have a review paper that's right up on SSRN right now that really looks at the attribution issue from soup to nuts. I mean, from beginning to end, which addresses all the technical issues and the political issues and legal issues and so on, which you might want to look at. But no, the commission didn't do that. All right.
Second question. On the liability question, the assumption that will become more of a thing as time goes on. I was wondering whether or not it was considered that you might not have some entity to go after. I mean that in the sense that, number one, the entity in question might be a startup that literally just has $50 left in their bank account, or number two, the entity in question might be some random LLC face of a company that's based in a different country and all they have on the ground here is just a P.O. box.
Okay. So your question is?
What consideration was there in that event?
That's at a level of detail which we didn't address. I think the answer to that, though, is that we have that problem now. Mm-hmm. And we have a fairly robust liability regime for physical products. Forget about the cyber part. For physical products, and in practice, what you do is you go after the party with the deepest pockets. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if you can't get the guy who put in the defective ROM chip because he's the security because he's offshore or whatever, you go after the system integrator. And if you can't get the system integrator, then you go after the distributor, and so on. I mean, so it goes. You may say this is a stupid way to run a country, okay? But the lawyers will disagree with you, and that is in fact what we have, right? So there is a robust liability structure, for enforcing liability. Yeah.
I don't know if it's robust enough, because I'm thinking of prior to the Obama administration, where we found weaknesses in security for infrastructure. If the company is liable, then they pay for fixing it. But if a cyber attack occurs, then the taxpayer is responsible.
That's true, and there is actually legislation. There's actually
Yes.
in the executive order, I believe, that actually exempts them from this kind of liability. You're absolutely right, but that's true for cybersecurity. Okay? It's not true for any other aspect of security or reliability. And look, here's the argument. Okay, the argument is that if I have an IoT device, a toaster. And the toaster burns my house down because some hacker got into it. Okay, I'm going to sue the manufacturer of the toaster. Okay, and the manufacturer of the toaster is not going to be able to bracket off the IT part of it that says no, we can't accept liability for that part. That's what I mean. No, I mean I'm going to sue and I don't care what the EULA says. Okay. There's going to be some judge that's going to come along and say, that's contrary to public policy. Okay. That's bad policy, and I'm not going to allow that to stand. And at that point, that will be appealed and so on, but that's the way it'll start. So I think that's the way it's going to go. And the question there is, do you want to get in front of it to establish some sort of coherent regime, or do you want to have random judges deciding on what this is? Now, knowing the way the country works, I suspect that that the random judges are the way to. But they're not. But the point is that they are eventually going to go down in that direction. It's really implausible to think of any other scenario.
Actually, unfortunately, it may kill IoT because in IoT world there are too many connections between devices, and very difficult to define which device is responsible. Toaster burns your house, but toaster may burn because some controller in your house, some router provided, and you change.
What you're telling me is that establishing extent of responsibility under liability laws is complicated, and that's true. But it's complicated now, and we sort it out.
But
But the DIN attack was quite different in that my refrigerator might have DOSed you, but I don't care.
That's a question.
That's a different issue.
I agree. That's right. It's a different issue. It's a different. Exactly. And that's misaligned incentives. You know, if I buy a refrigerator, I don't care. I'm not going to invest in more security to make you more secure. That's right.
The customer is not the victim.
That's right. And that's an example of perverse incentives.
There is a case almost analogous that we sort of deal with, which is attractive nuisance. If you have a swimming pool, you're required to protect people who are not you from dangers there.
Yes.
So if your refrigerator attacks me, why can't I sue you? I may rather sue large refrigerator maker too, but what the heck, I don't like your shiny head. Throw you in too.
Well, I agree that there are interesting ways of looking at this, and we'll see how it sorts itself out. The only point here is that you can't say with confidence that there's never going to be liability for cybersecurity breaches.
Otherwise, it would be a chaos.
It will be
a chaos. I mean, some arbitrary decisions which would be not good.
Well, I think we'll see. The whole tort liability system at this point is established out of practice of common law. Okay, and that's likely how this is going to go too.
Decide what is a reasonable data security standard are going to be the insurance companies.
We also talk about insurance companies. Yes.
The litigation costs of deciding whether they're going to cover your litigation or not. The people who are going to decide whether to pay out on a claim made against you are going to be the insurance companies, not government, who's going to necessarily be behind the times in determining what is a reasonable state-of-the-art security standards require.
No disagreement. No disagreement with that. That happened in fire security, in fire safety, and so on. It'll happen in cybersecurity too. And
since the report was geared towards economic considerations, was that part of the report?
Yes. The role of insurance companies is addressed in the report. Yes, it is. So, tell me why you believe that it's cheaper to do cybersecurity from the beginning. I don't believe it.
Build on a simpler platform that doesn't assume that every program that runs in the system has access to everything, has access to all of my files.
How does that?
It's unconventional, but it's not easier. It's not harder.
Actually, you need to force small companies to follow some standard about security, because without that, it may invent a good device but bad security. And it would be very difficult to change that if the device comes, for example, popular.
The idea of putting constraints, explicit constraints.
No. It's like standards like electricity. You have a code of conduct.
No, but the problem is that nobody knows what to put in that in that code of conduct for security. Over here.
Oh, I was going to say that when intelligent, well-meaning people disagree, often it's a semantic disagreement in the terminology. Are you saying that designing in security from the start is cheaper than having a system released without security? Or are you saying that it's cheaper than releasing it first and retrofitting it later? If you start on Unix or Windows or Mac, and then try to add the security in, then adding that security will cost you more. Of course, but that's not the issue. The question that he was raising was that when you're first trying to get something out of the door as cheaply as possible, is it cheaper to put out something that's weak, or is it cheaper to put out something that's secure? Yes, but not harder.
So
you do it faster. It's a question of speed.
No, actually, so for example, we've learned good programming practice is to isolate functions from each other. If that's a security concern as well, if you do that so it is done securely, that's just as easy as encapsulating for functionality. This is not a hard.
Knowing startups the way I know them, okay, I just don't believe it. That people
they don't know either.
Wait a minute.
I'm in a startup, so I can.
I understand. I see kludges coming up all the time. Okay, yes. The right way. Look, I know the right way to do all this. There's a proof of concept. Okay, I cobbled together something just to show that it works. okay, then the right thing to do at that point is to throw it away and start over again and do it right. Okay? Okay? That means I agree with you. That's the right way to do it.
That costs extra.
But that costs extra, and it will take more time to get something out to the market than if I just market the kludge. Okay? There's an old saying that, the question is, you will throw away your first attempt, right? The operational question is, are you going to throw it away before or after you deliver it to the customer? Right? That's the real question. Okay? And in the environment in which time to market is everything, the answer is obvious. You deliver the thing that you're going to throw away later. And that's my point. That's why I don't believe the comment.
It's true that the conventional programmer, which includes 99% of us or more, will start out on a classic operating system because he doesn't want to write that part.
Right.
And if you start out that way, then your first one will be insecure.
Right.
So you don't start out that way, and that's unconventional.
And you shouldn't start out that way if your goal is to have a secure, reliable system at the end of it. But that's not your goal. Your goal is to get market share.
But in fact, we have 2 examples where we have improved usability and functionality because we added security.
Yes, I believe that. I believe that. But I would argue that those are very much the exception.
I don't think they have to be. When you talk to people, they say there's a fundamental conflict between security and usability, security and functionality. And if you start from that premise, you will find that to be true. What I'm stating is the examples that show that premise is false, every time we've tried to do it, we found a way to do it, because we started from a better premise.
Okay. What I think that these axes are in some sense security and usability or some other desirable attribute. Okay. Now, my claim is that there is, and you can argue about whether or not but there's some curve at some place that says that you have to trade off security against usability at some point. Now, let me definition of security. I understand, but so that means the curve moves and you change the units and so on. But at some point there is. Now, I also fully acknowledge that down here, I can certainly have both crappy usability and crappy security. That's easy. I know how to do that, right? And so under those circumstances, I clearly can improve both. Okay, and there's no question about that. But when my claim is that when you get into this borderline region, that there is going to be a trade-off.
We had a quite secure, one of our tools was quite secure, and we had a user actually ask us how to turn on security. So the usability was there, the security was there, we were closer to the upper right-hand corner than to the lower left. So we have a proof of, we have an example that shows it can be done.
I don't disagree with it. I don't think it changes the general statement.
There are general patterns that conventional operating systems do not support that make it possible.
I don't know quite how to respond to that one.
I'm sort of surprised that this debate is going on. Your premise seemed to be that for at least some of the startups rushing something out, for at least some of the designers, we're more worried about going bankrupt than they are about stuff that lies 10 years down the road. For some designers that may or may not be scrupulous, there will always be some people who find that it's easier or better or faster or more pragmatic to get something out however they have to do that and never get around to filling in the gaps.
Well, I think that statement, is uncontroversial. I think I don't think so. I think even these guys would believe that. But I think the question is how generally true that is, and how easy it is and whether that's sort of the default assumption that characterizes most of the world.
I would argue that if I'm writing the next flashlight app, I can slap something together. But if I'm writing an enterprise app, a service, something like that, that has to be in a mission-critical environment, I'm going to have to make that first version reasonably good. And what I'm saying is if you use good design principles at that point, the security comes along pretty much for free.
Pretty much.
The startups you're talking about, the 6-month cycle to produce the first product, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about, the mission-critical enterprise app, the company goes out of business if this thing doesn't do its job. For those things, I believe that using good design principles from the start gets you out the door faster and cheaper. But with existing frameworks, like the NIST framework in particular, it won't give you security. But there are frameworks that will give you, as part of your basic design, as part of what you do anyway for reliable code, will give you the security.
Well,
that's what
having seen a bunch of very large, bet your company kinds of enterprise software development operations tank because they were unable to get their act together to do what you're saying. I certainly don't disagree with the theoretical possibility. I just think that it's just very, very rare.
I contend the reason they failed was because if I was going there, I wouldn't start from here. The best practice today isn't even good in many respects, and trying to follow best practice will get you in that kind of trouble.
We're going to turn off the cameras so the truth can come out.
Okay.
The real truth.
Okay, thanks. A late adopter of technology for exactly that reason. Let somebody else be on the bleeding edge. So I'm here to talk because a last-minute speaker canceled, and that's fine. So you're the first audience that I've given this talk to. The Presidential Commission released a report. That report last Friday, in fact, publicly. It was given to the president on Thursday, the day before, and this is the result of 7 months of deliberation on what you will see is a very broad charge. Okay. The Commission will make detailed recommendations to strengthen cybersecurity in both the public and private sectors while protecting privacy, ensuring safety, public safety, national economic security, fostering discovery and development of new technical solutions, and bolstering partnerships between federal, state, and local governments and the private sector in the development, promotion, and use of cybersecurity technologies, best practices, and policies. Okay, that's a mouthful. It's a very broad charge, right? We had 7 months to produce a report on this. We had the report is available online at that website. If you just type in into a Google search cybersecurity commission report, the URL pops up. This led to something called the NIST cybersecurity framework. Now, NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, had had responsibility for creating this framework. It's a voluntary framework for critical infrastructure organizations to manage their cybersecurity. It was intended to give people give agencies and entities within the private sector that think about cybersecurity, that provide critical infrastructure services to think about cybersecurity, a language to talk about their cybersecurity efforts and how they've made progress and so on. And it was meant to be entirely voluntary. 3 years later, the administration announced its National Cybersecurity Action Plan and created the commission. This is the commission that I sat on, and it was drawn from business and former government and academia, and we were tasked to create the recommendations as I described earlier. And the idea was to concrete recommendations to improve cybersecurity over the next decade. That was the intent. Okay. What can the U.S. government do? It's meant to provide a roadmap for the next president. Throughout most of the process, we didn't know who the next. All right. In the introduction, I'm here at Stanford now, and I have been here for 2 years, and I work on cyber policy and I work on cyber policy and security issues here at Stanford, and do a lot of work with policymakers and so on cybersecurity. I spent 25 years in Washington before that. 29 years in Washington before that, working IT policy issues, and before that I was a congressional staff member, a staff scientist for a congressional committee. So I have some familiarity with the way in which the system works. The story that was just told about technology and so on, and putting criminality in your pockets. Some years ago, I came across a wonderful saying to the effect that there are 3 roads to ruin. Sex is the most fun, alcohol is the fastest, and technology is the most certain. And I have come to believe that, and over the years I have become of most pride of us on the committee, on the commission, is that it's posted on the White House site. Not just in this site, which was the group that organized it. This is the site that was established to manage it, manage the whole process. They had a variety of public meetings and so on, and it was charged by executive order to be created. The broad context for the commission here is that in February of 2013, so about 3.5 years ago, the Obama administration issued an executive order, a presidential order, on improving critical infrastructure of cybersecurity. That is, critical infrastructure is supposed to be that infrastructure largely in the private sector that is critical for national operations, for national activity. So it's things like the banking system, the electric grid, and so on.
Does it include the election?
Well, that's an interesting question. The answer is no, except insofar as state and local governments were in fact included in that. And as you may know, elections are the electoral machinery is a part of state and local governments. I will talk about that later, and if you want to talk about that more during the discussion, I'm happy to do that. This president was going to be, and we were really quite scrupulous in not identifying Republicans or Democrats. The chair of the commission is known to be a Democrat. The vice chair of the commission is known to be a Republican, but beyond that, you could not tell by listening to the people around the table who was R and who was D. Okay, this was a list of the commissioners. Donnellan was a former National Security Advisor to the President, Democrat, obviously, and Sam Palmisano, former CEO of IBM, vice chair, known to be Republican. But as I say, everyone else there, the political affiliation is unknown, and that was not a consideration in either their selection or, in fact, in any of the discussions. I'll tell you quite candidly that there were really no ideological discussions among the commissioners. It was all very pragmatic. We all had ideologies, but it was all very pragmatic. Ranging from Keith Alexander to who was a former NSA director, president of MasterCard, president of the chancellor of the University of Pittsburgh system, former NIST director. Okay, a wide variety of players. So yeah.
Looks very rich in policy expertise.